All right, let's dive in. Today, German reunification. Seems pretty straightforward at first glance, right?
Right.
But there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. More than just tearing down a wall, rebuilding a whole nation. Challenges, surprises, the whole 9 yards.
We've got some Wikipedia excerpts to guide us, but we really want to uncover those hidden stories, the unexpected reactions, the stuff that really makes you think.
Absolutely. It's a period that's always fascinated me. Just to think, a country divided for, what, over 40 years? Physically and ideologically, and then suddenly it's back together.
So Germany was divided after World War II, we all know that. But how did that wall, that Iron Curtain, actually come down? What started it all?
Well, you might be surprised to hear it wasn't one big dramatic event, more like a bunch of smaller things that, kind of had a domino effect. And those cracks in the Eastern Bloc, they were showing way before the Berlin Wall fell.
So a slow burn, not an explosion. What were some of those key moments, the things that really started to shift the landscape?
One that comes to mind is the Pan-European picnic. Happened on the border of Austria and Hungary, August of '89. It was meant to be a peace demonstration, but it turned into something much, much bigger.
Okay, how does a picnic help bring down the Iron Curtain? That's got to be a good story.
Well, thousands of East Germans, they were already on vacation in Hungary, and they saw this picnic as their chance to escape to the West.
So this picnic was kind of a carefully planned escape route?
You could say that. The organizers, guys like Otto von Habsburg, they knew what they were doing. They opened a border gate for a few hours, cut through the barbed wire fence. It was symbolic, but it became a floodgate. Thousands crossed over.
Wow. Powerful image, cutting through that fence. I bet that sent a pretty clear message.
It did. The Eastern Bloc, it was losing its grip. And leaders like Erich Honecker, the East German leader, they saw it as a direct challenge.
I bet they weren't happy. Did they try to stop it?
Honecker, he was furious. Felt betrayed, even. There's a quote from him in the Daily Mirror. Accuses Habsburg of bribing East Germans to defect, offering Deutschmarks, gifts, the whole bit. Shows how threatened he felt.
A peace demonstration turns into a mass exodus.
That's wild. So this picnic was like, what? A butterfly effect moment?
Yeah.
Leading to the fall of the wall just a few months later?
That's a good way to put it. Exposed how fragile the Eastern Bloc really was, gave courage to those who wanted freedom, put a ton of pressure on leaders like Honecker. It was a pivotal moment. Peaceful protest and the growing desire for change.
Okay, so the wall comes down, Germany reunifies. Happy ending, right? But then there's this thing you hear about, the wall on the head. What's that all about?
Yes. Because even after the physical wall came down, there were still deep divisions, East Germans and West Germans. It was like 40 years of separation had built a mental barrier. And that was harder to tear down than any concrete wall.
So it wasn't just boom, wall's gone, everyone's one big happy family. Not quite. Think about it. East and West Germans, they lived under totally different systems. Political, economic, everything. Different values, experiences, expectations, even different slang. It was like two different worlds trying to merge.
Wow, even with a shared language and history. Amazing how years of separation can do that.
It really shows you how powerful those systems and ideologies are. They shape how people live their lives, how they see the world. Growing up in a society controlled by the state versus one with individual freedom, free markets, it's a huge difference.
Huge. Okay, so you've got these differences. But how did they play out in everyday life? Any real-life examples of this wall in the head?
Oh, tons. Take the economy, for example. East Germany's infrastructure was, stuck in the past. Industries were inefficient. Lots of people lost their jobs trying to adapt to a market economy. And West Germany had to pay for rebuilding the East, which led to some resentment on both sides.
I never realized how much rebuilding was involved. Was there anything specific that really highlights that economic strain?
Well, remember the solidarity surcharge. That special tax West Germans paid to finance reunification, it's still around today, actually, shows you the long-term financial commitment involved in bringing those two economies together.
Wow, so West Germans are literally still paying for reunification today. That's something. But what about culturally? Any clashes there?
Definitely. Stereotypes about Ossis and Wessis. East Germans were seen as lazy or backward, and West Germans were seen as arrogant and materialistic. It was like two tribes merging, each with their own customs.
It's funny, you'd think after 40 years of separation, people would be thrilled to be back together. But it seems like there was quite a bit of opposition to reunification, even within Germany. How could that be?
It's a good question, and it's something we'll look at more in the next part of our deep dive. But let's just say the reasons for opposing reunification were complex. Some people worried about German nationalism making a comeback, others were worried about losing their cultural identity, and some were just worried about the economic fallout.
Hold on, people were actually against reunification. This is getting interesting. Okay, but before we get into those internal struggles, let's zoom out a bit. How did the rest of the world react to all this? Were they all celebrating?
Not exactly. Some key players were actually quite unhappy about a unified Germany.
Really? Who wasn't popping the champagne? I mean, you'd think everyone would be relieved to see the end of the Cold War, a divided Europe.
Well, one very prominent voice of dissent was Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister.
Seriously. She was so tough on communism. Why would she be against a unified, democratic Germany?
It's interesting, isn't it? But to understand her perspective, you got to think about where she was coming from. She grew up in the shadow of World War II, saw the devastation caused by a powerful Germany. She didn't trust their ambitions, worried about history repeating itself.
So she was afraid of Germany becoming too powerful again, maybe turning aggressive like in the past.
There's a famous story where she's supposed to have told Gorbachev, "We defeated the Germans twice, and now they're back." Shows how deep that fear ran. She even carried a map of Germany's 1937 borders around, apparently, to make her point about their potential for expansion.
Wow, that's intense. She saw reunification as a threat then, a step backward, not forward.
That's it, exactly. And she wasn't alone. Francois Mitterrand, the French president, had serious concerns too. He compared a unified Germany to Hitler, said they could make more ground than even Adolf had.
Yikes. Strong words. So Mitterrand was worried too, huh? Was it just historical anxieties, or was there more to it?
It was a mix of things. Like Thatcher, he had lived through World War II, but he also had concerns about, the balance of power in Europe. A unified Germany, especially one aligned with the U.S., could disrupt that balance. And that could mean trouble for France.
So there was this real fear, especially among those who'd seen the horrors of World War II, that Germany could become too dominant again. Fascinating.
It shows you that even positive events, like a divided nation coming back together, can trigger all sorts of anxieties, especially when you look at it through the lens of history and geopolitics.
This is already so much more complex than I imagined. A domino effect bringing down the wall, a wall in the head between East and West Germans, and world leaders freaking out about the consequences. But all this political wrangling had to cost a fortune, right?
Let's talk about the economics of merging two entire countries.
Oh yeah, trillions of euros, and that was just the beginning.
So before we went to what you would call a break, we were talking about how not everyone was exactly thrilled about a unified Germany. But now let's turn our attention inward a little bit. You mentioned that some people within Germany were actually opposed to reunification. It's true, and I think it's one of the most, fascinating parts of this whole story. It kind of challenges that simple narrative of a nation just, joyfully embracing unity. It was way more complex than that. And it says a lot about the impact of being divided and the difficulties of creating, a truly unified national identity.
Okay, so who exactly was against reunification, and what were their reasons? It seems a little counterintuitive that anyone would be against their own country coming back together.
It might seem that way, yeah. But when you dig a little deeper, you start to see things from their point of view. And it wasn't just one group either. You had intellectuals, feminists, ethnic minorities, even some Jewish groups, all with their own concerns about what a unified Germany would actually mean for them, their communities.
That's really interesting. You'd think everybody would just be ecstatic about the wall coming down, the country reuniting. Why the hesitation? Why would some people resist that?
Well, let's start with the intellectuals. A lot of them, they were really worried about nationalism making a comeback. They remembered Germany's past, obviously, the Nazis, the horrors of that regime, and all the destruction caused by, unchecked nationalism. For them, reunification was like, waking up a sleeping giant. And they weren't so sure which way that giant was going to start walking.
So they were afraid of a unified Germany becoming a threat again, like going back to that aggressive, expansionist behavior.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. These intellectuals, they'd seen the dangers of nationalism firsthand. They felt like they had to speak out against it, even if everyone else was celebrating. It was almost like a form of patriotism for them, trying to protect their country from repeating the mistakes of the past.
Like they saw their opposition as a way of being responsible, I guess, looking out for the future.
Exactly. They were patriots, absolutely. But they weren't against unity, necessarily, just unity at any cost, They wanted to make sure it was built on the right foundation. Solid democratic values, commitment to peace. and a clear rejection of those nationalist ideologies that had caused so much damage in the past.
It's a good reminder that even positive events can have, well, unintended consequences,
Hmm.
and that it's always important to think critically, even when, everyone's caught up in the excitement.
I think that's right. And these intellectuals, they weren't just, complaining from the sidelines. They were involved in public debates, writing articles, giving speeches, all of that. They were trying to make a difference, trying to make sure those lessons of the past weren't forgotten.
Okay, so we've got intellectuals worried about nationalism. But you also mentioned feminists being skeptical. What were their concerns about reunification?
For feminist groups, the big issue was women's rights, social progress, all of that. And this is where things get really interesting because East Germany, as authoritarian as it was, had actually made a lot of progress in terms of gender equality, especially compared to West Germany.
Wait, so you're saying East Germany was more progressive when it came to women's rights?
Yeah.
That's not what I would have expected.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it's true. East German women, they had better access to education, job opportunities, more likely to be in leadership positions even, and they had better childcare facilities, which meant they could participate more fully in the workforce.
So what did they think would happen after reunification? That they'd lose all that progress?
That was their main concern, yeah. They were worried about, going backwards. That reunification would mean adopting the more traditional gender roles, social norms, all of that were more common in West Germany.
So unity came with a risk for them, a potential cost, maybe losing some of those freedoms and social gains they had fought for.
Exactly. And it wasn't just like an abstract fear. As things unfolded, some of their concerns did come true. Childcare facilities in the East, they were scaled back. Women faced new economic challenges. The whole transition to a market economy was tough on a lot of people, but especially women. It was, a complicated situation with both good and bad aspects to it.
It just goes to show that progress isn't always a straight line. Even when something good happens, it doesn't always affect everyone in the same way. Some groups might even end up worse off. Speaking of which, you also mentioned some opposition from ethnic minorities, particularly in the East. What were they worried about?
For them, it was a combination of things: historical experiences, cultural identity, and, a feeling of vulnerability in this new unified Germany. A lot of these minorities, especially those from Eastern Europe, they remember the discrimination and persecution they faced under the Nazis. And for some, reunification brought back those fears, a fear that this new Germany might not be so tolerant or welcoming to those who weren't seen as fully German.
So they were afraid of history repeating itself,
Yeah.
of being targeted again because of their background, their ethnicity.
Exactly. And on top of that historical trauma, there was also, cultural anxiety. These minority groups, they had built their own communities, their own ways of life in East Germany, their own institutions, traditions, all of that. It was a sense of belonging within that system, even if it was authoritarian.
So they saw East Germany as a kind of protector, in a way, a place where their culture was recognized and respected.
Yeah, and they worried that reunification would mean losing that they would be pressured to conform to the dominant West German culture, a culture that maybe didn't understand or value their traditions and experiences. They were afraid of losing their identity, of being absorbed into this larger German society and having their voices silenced.
It's a reminder that national unity, as great as it sounds, can also be seen as a threat, especially by those who are worried about losing their voice, their place in this new society.
That's a really good point. And it's not just about Germany either. We see these same tensions all over the world. Anytime you try to create a unified national identity, you run into these issues of power dynamics. Who gets to tell the story? Whose experiences matter? Whose are forgotten?
Okay, so we've talked about intellectuals, feminists, ethnic minorities. You also mentioned opposition from some Jewish groups. Why would they be hesitant about a unified Germany?
This is probably the most complicated aspect of all the opposition to reunification. I mean, think about it. Jewish communities in Germany, they experienced the worst of the worst, the Holocaust. That trauma, it cast a long shadow. And for some, it made it really hard to embrace the idea of a unified Germany.
Yeah, I can see how that history would make it difficult. Were they mainly worried about anti-Semitism coming back?
That was definitely part of it. Some worried that a unified Germany would be more vulnerable to, right-wing nationalist groups. And those groups often have anti-Semitic views. They were afraid of discrimination, hate speech, even violence, all the things they had already suffered through.
Given their history, it's completely understandable that they would feel that way.
Yeah.
It's scary to think about those kinds of ideologies coming back, even in a new democratic Germany.
It shows how deep those scars run, how an event like the Holocaust can affect generations. But there was also a more complex side to their opposition. It had to do with identity and memory.
What do you mean by that?
Well, some Jewish groups, they had created their own space within East Germany, their own institutions, cultural practices, a real sense of community. And it was separate in some ways from the larger German society. They had found a way to exist, to preserve their traditions, to remember their history on their own terms.
So they found a way to live in East Germany, but not fully assimilate, not lose their identity.
Exactly. And they were worried that reunification would mean losing that, being swallowed up by this larger German nation and having their identity, their history kind of, I don't know, overshadowed or maybe even distorted. They didn't want to lose control of their own narrative.
It's like they were afraid of being silenced, of having their experiences minimized or forgotten in this new Germany. And that's not just a concern for the Jewish community, right?
Yeah.
Other minority groups who had found a place in East Germany probably felt the same way.
You're right. It's about power, really. When you build a national identity, you have to ask who gets to decide what that identity is, whose stories are told, whose are ignored. These are questions that come up all the time, especially during big social and political changes.
It's like unity, even though it's supposed to be a good thing, can also be a threat, especially for those who are already marginalized or feel like they don't have a voice.
Exactly. And German reunification is a perfect example of that. It was a messy, complicated process, full of anxiety, different groups fighting for their interests, and the ghosts of the past always looming in the background.
It's so much more than just tearing down a wall and celebrating, isn't it?
Way more. And as we continue exploring this part of German history, we'll see how those complexities continue to play out in the years after reunification. The economic problems, the social tensions, the ongoing struggle to truly create a unified nation, all of that shaped Germany's path in the 21st century.
It's like reunification was just the start, really. The first chapter in a much longer story. A story about negotiation, adaptation, and hopefully healing. Speaking of which, let's move on to that next chapter, the aftermath of reunification. All those political changes, social upheaval, internal debates, it all must have left its mark on this new, unified Germany. What were some of the lasting effects of this massive event? Well, stay tuned, because we're going to explore the economic and social challenges of merging East and West Germany. And we'll tackle the big question: can a nation truly heal from the wounds of division? All right, welcome back to our deep dive on German reunification. We've uncovered a lot of, I guess you could say, unexpected stuff already. The domino effect leading up to the wall coming down, the opposition to reunification, even from people within Germany itself. But now we got to talk about what happened after the wall fell. The long process of integration, trying to build a truly unified nation. It's kind of like, you have the wedding, the big celebration, and then the real work of building a life together starts. Except this is like on a national scale.
That's a great way to think about it. And like any marriage, there were going to be challenges, right? Adjustments to make, maybe even some arguments along the way. As East and West Germany tried to figure out how to, merge their lives, their systems, their whole identities.
So let's talk about those challenges. What were some of the biggest hurdles they had to overcome in those early years after reunification?
Well, right off the bat, there was a huge economic gap between East and West Germany. The East had been under a communist planned economy for, over 40 years? So their infrastructure was way behind, their industries were inefficient, and the workforce wasn't used to, how a market economy works.
So it was like trying to combine, I don't know, a horse and buggy with a bullet train, and hoping they could both get to the same place at the same time. How did they even begin to address that? Just throw a ton of money at it.
Well, money was definitely part of it. The West German government spent billions of euros trying to modernize things in the East. New infrastructure, revitalizing industries, retraining workers. Remember that solidarity surcharge we talked about? A lot of that went to those efforts.
So West Germans were, in a way, paying for reunification directly out of their own pockets. That's got to be a tough sell, especially with all those anxieties people had about the economic impact. Did it work, though? Did all that investment actually close the gap between East and West?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. There were definitely successes. Some parts of the East saw a real economic boom, and overall the standard of living went up a lot for people in the East. But the truth is, the East is still behind the West economically, even after all these years.
So that wall in the head we talked about, it's still there, in a way, at least when it comes to the economy.
Yeah, I think you could say that. Unemployment in the East is still higher than in the West, and wages are lower, on average. A lot of young people, skilled workers, they've moved from east to west looking for better jobs. It's kind of a brain drain for the East.
It's like they haven't been able to fully level the playing field, even with all the time and money that's been invested. It makes you think that healing the wounds of division, even within one country, it's a really long and difficult process. And it's not just about economics either, right?
Absolutely. The economic challenges were tied up with all these social and cultural tensions. Think about it. You're an East German who's lived your whole life under communism, where the state took care of things like jobs and social welfare. Suddenly, you're thrown into this competitive market economy. Your skills might not be what employers are looking for. The future's uncertain. It was a really tough adjustment for a lot of people.
So for a lot of East Germans, reunification meant, I don't know, a sense of loss, maybe? Like their world was turned upside down.
Yeah.
Even though it brought new freedoms and opportunities, it also created this feeling of disruption, almost like a culture shock.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And then on top of that, you had this sense that West German norms and values were kind of taking over. So some East Germans felt like their way of life was being erased, like they were becoming second-class citizens in their own country.
So it wasn't just about money, it was about culture too. This clash of values, this fight for recognition and identity within this new Germany.
Right. And you saw that clash playing out everywhere, at work, in schools, in the media, even just in everyday conversations. Those stereotypes about Osis and Wessis, it wasn't just harmless teasing. It reflected this deeper tension, this feeling of being different. And that feeling lasted a lot longer than the wall itself.
It's crazy how those labels, those ways of categorizing people, they stick around even after the original reason for the division is gone.
It shows you that social and cultural differences, even within a country that speaks the same language and has the same history, they don't just disappear overnight. It takes time and effort.
So integrating East and West Germany, it wasn't just about like building new roads and factories. It was about bridging this huge cultural gap, a gap in how people experienced life, how they saw the world. How do they try to do that? Just hope that things would get better over time.
Well, time definitely helps, but they also knew they had to do more than that. There were all these programs, initiatives aimed at getting East and West Germans to understand each other better, educational programs, cultural exchanges. The government even had policies that encouraged people to work together, collaborate. The whole idea was to create a shared national identity and to break down that wall in the head.
So like a nationwide therapy session almost. Trying to heal the psychological damage of being divided and build a new sense of, who we are as a country. Did it work?
Well, therapy takes time, right? It's a process. And there were setbacks along the way, for sure. There's still some resentment. Those old stereotypes haven't totally disappeared. And the economic disparities, they're still there.
So that wall in the head, it hasn't completely crumbled?
Not completely, no. But there are signs that things are getting better. There's more understanding, more acceptance between East and West Germans now, especially the younger generations, the ones who grew up after reunification. They don't really see themselves as Ossi or Wessi. They're just German.
Makes sense. If
Well,
you didn't live through the division, you'd probably have a different outlook. Less baggage, It's like they're creating a new national story, one that's more inclusive, more focused on the future.
that's a good way to think about it. And even
Yeah.
though it's still a work in progress, even though there are still challenges, I think German reunification shows us what's possible. A nation trying to heal itself after being divided, trying to build a fairer society for everyone, and create this new identity that honors both its past and its future.
It's a story that has meaning for everyone, really, not just Germans. It reminds us that unity isn't just a place you arrive at. It's a journey where you have to celebrate, but also think critically about the past. It's about progress, but also about reconciliation.
And it's about understanding that true unity doesn't mean erasing all our differences. It means finding ways to bridge those differences, to build a society where everyone feels like they belong, no matter where they come from or what their history is.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into German reunification. It's been a fascinating look at a moment in history that, well, it still shapes Germany and the world today.